Very briefly, I want to discuss the difference between natural and artificial selection as a reminder for you. When we talk artificial selection, we often talk about dog breeds. And at this point, within dog breeding, we have some major issues that have to be addressed as far as selection of particular genetics. Because with the selection of phenotypes that are of interest to breeders, they may carry along with them some recessive traits that are not desired in the breeding lines. So when we talk about purebred dogs, they're actually now looking at about 25% of them that have some serious genetic defect. This might be blindness or deafness. We also look at things like hip dysplasia in these breeds. But this is all a result of artificial selection. So artificial selection, remember, is selection by humans of some particular characteristic that we like in either dog breeds, cat breeds, agriculture, whatever. So what we need to take a minute and think about is, if we are looking at variation of population, what is the original source of any new allele in a population or in a species? I don't want to think about genetic drift. I'm not interested in gene flow. That all occurs after we have a new source of allele. So what is that new source? One other thing we can think about with natural selection is genetic drift, and we've talked genetic drift. Genetic drift had two options that we discussed. Read this question and tell me what mechanism could have contributed to genetic differences between mainland and Newfoundland moose. Right on your worksheet. So there are still 3 points that really guide evolution and natural selection. We have to remember that populations evolve, not individuals. We have to look at traits that are heritable. I'm not interested in anything that you cannot pass on to your offspring. So this has to typically be a trait that is part of your gametes, or at least part of your chromosome set that is then, through meiosis, made part of your gametes. We also have to think about evolution as not being goal-directed. We can't say, I want to be taller. Evolution doesn't care. If there's no reason for you to be taller and you don't have the alleles necessary to be taller, it's not going to happen. So what we have to look at is that evolution is not going to lead to perfection. Here's a prime example. When we look at natural selection, we have to think about it as an editing process. Okay? This is not you're going to dream up the best organism you possibly can and evolution will get you there. It's not going to happen. You have to edit the allele or gene pool that you already have. So by that, things are not going to be perfect. Perfection is not an option here. Okay? We also have to look at the fact that natural selection works based on the current environment of a population. So natural selection is only going to work if a trait is favorable in a population, in a given environment. If you change that population, you change that environment, you move that population to a different environment, none of this will hold. Everything will be back up for grabs. So we can only work on existing variation, so those are our alleles. We have to be limited by what we've inherited from previous generations. Okay? We have to look at the fact that some adaptations are simply compromises. So we'll look at a structure performing many functions. So with your arm, you can wave, you can swim, you can write things. But are any of those things perfect? Well, some of them are really good, but I wouldn't say that any of them are perfect. You could find way better ways to swim than with that arm you've got sticking out the side of you, right? And the fact that environments change, often very unpredictably, okay? So rapid changes in environment make things even less perfect. Let's look at non-perfection. This thing is something known as an Archaeopteryx. This is what we think is the intermediate between reptiles and birds. Why? Well, feathers. That's bird-like. It's got a beak. Well, but the beak has teeth. Birds don't have teeth most of the time. There are a couple of exceptions, but very few. There are claws on the wings. Can you imagine a cardinal flying straight at you with claws coming out of its wings? That's frightening. One thing you may not know is birds don't have vertebrae out their tail feathers. They have a little stub of vertebrae, the tailbone, that would attach the feathers, but they don't have vertebrae out their tail. Okay? So this kind of intermediate guy we'll look at more later, but I want you to think, if evolution was perfect, would it have created something like this? I don't think so. So when we look at something that's fittest, so a phenotype that is most fit, what was fitness again? Okay. We have to look at the fact that there is no perfect phenotype in an environment. It's the idea that in the given environment, with the given alleles, we have a possibility to have a good, but not perfect, individual. We'll look at the Galapagos finches, as I mentioned to you, when we look more at macroevolution, because this results in a speciation event. What they looked at, Peter and Rosemary Grant, looked at changes in the environment and then looked at resulting phenotypes in bird populations. And what they found was those that actually survived a drought had big beaks. Well, if you're going to survive a drought, why would you need a big beak? Big beak means that you can eat harder things, right? Harder seeds and so on. After a drought, plants are going to have very hard seeds produced, all right? So of the survivors of the drought, so this is the P population. Of the F1 population, their surviving offspring had beaks that were 4 to 5% larger than the pre-population to this drought. So they see this repeatedly over and over and over again, all right? So the pre-beak depth, so the pre-drought depth versus the depth associated with this drought is pretty significant. So in 1976, we actually see the beak height being shorter. So beak height or beak depth is actually on our x-axis here, and number of individuals is on our y. Okay, so our pre-beak depth, pre-drought beak depth is smaller, about 9.5 inches, or 9.5 millimeters. 9.5 inches, that would be a giant beak. Oh my goodness. But 1978, so after this drought, so this is after drought, we see a shift to a much larger beak depth, so about 10¼ millimeters. Now, you might not think that there's much difference between 9½ and 10¼ millimeters, and under normal conditions you'd be right. But when we look at beak depth in birds, that's a significant investment in a phenotype to add that much weight and heft to that beak, just so that it can eat more seeds. So we'll look at these beak sizes. You can look at the differences here. Our large ground finch eating primarily seeds versus here our cactus finch that eats primarily small insects. So the difference in the beak size is huge, right? And then you get this little sharp-billed ground finch. What do you think he might eat? He's got a tiny little beak. What might he eat?